Thank you, Mahir. Is my screen visible?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the for organizing this webinar. So I'm Vinay Ramani. I'll be talking about supply chain considerations in privatization of services in developing countries. This is joint work with Debabrata Ghosh at the Essex Business School and Professor Manmohan Sodhi at the University of London. Okay. So let me begin with a small motivation, which is that of the fact that governments in developing countries have, since in the context of India at least, since the 1990s, there has been a lot of discussion on privatization of state-owned enterprises. Primarily, the purpose of undertaking these privatization activities has been that most of these state-owned enterprises were loss-making. So one way that the government hoped was to get these loss-making enterprises either have fresh foreign direct investment and make them more competitive, and also some of them had the government just did not want to keep on subsidizing those. Okay. Since the 1990s, several sectors in which privatization has taken place in India has been in the banking sector, petrochemicals, and also in several services sector. One of the sectors that in the service industry that we are going to talk about today, in this particular paper, is on the travel and tourism. Okay, so that's the context in which this paper is being presented. Okay, and in the context of India, as far as the tourism industry is concerned, there are many government sites there are many sites which are government owned and operated, many tourist sites. Then one of the objectives of the government is to divest for the overall growth of the industry. The catch, though, now is that unlike the previous instances of privatization, which has primarily been with the objective of inducing fresh investment in these loss-making enterprises, here the government also wants to achieve social development through inclusive tourism. Okay, so the word inclusive tourism will appear all through this talk. It's not been easy for the government, primarily because of certain criticisms. One is, of course, that there has been the claim that privatization has led to crony capitalism, which is that a few powerful promoters in the private sectors have been hand in gloves with the politicians. There have been political economy studies on it. Also, as I mentioned, that most of the primary objective has been from looking at it through the lens of profit, right? How can we get the loss-making state-owned enterprises and somehow make them more efficient or invest or get fresh funds in them? The goal of consumer welfare and along with profit has not gotten that much attention, particularly when we talk about privatization. In fact, the social development goals, in fact, in just the talk before, Professor Tang mentioned about some of the sustainable development goals. That's also particularly important when you look at it from a developing country's perspective. Okay. And also, when you look at tourism assets in developing countries, the public entity which is being considered for privatization has a lot of very small private enterprises also working, right? So there are very marginalized communities, small entrepreneurs who are also associated as part of this particular sector. Now, what does the literature say? The literature has not been particularly helpful here, primarily because the focus has been on monolithic firms. What I mean by that is that the privatization literature, primarily in economics, has focused on a single firm. For example, if I give the context of what we call as mixed oligopoly, which is that a public firm competes with one or more private firms. But when you're talking about the tourism sector in let's say in India, it's not just a monolithic firm. There are firms operating at different levels. The tourism sector indeed is quite complex, right? So for example, there are coordinating agencies, right? There are agencies which will help the customer book tickets, book a reservation. There are service providers who will provide service at the point of delivery. There are also various various destination management organizations. There are also tour guides who make a living by providing that service. So essentially, it's a multi-tiered level, right? So looking at it from this context of a monolithic firm is missing the larger picture, and it is in that context that we are making a contribution, right? So our primary contribution is taking a supply chain perspective in analytically examining the profits and consumer welfare in various configurations possible, including those within a two-tiered structure. Okay. Now, some modeling assumptions before I get into the specifics of the model, right? So what I have here is that, so some assumptions that we will make are, so for the private entity is a profit maximizing entity. The public entity, unlike the literature in economics, which does not put any constraints, we are going to require the public entity to earn non-negative profits. The public entity's objective is very, very specific. It's a welfare objective, where by welfare, we are including the consumer surplus, right, for providing the service, and the profit of the private entities who are providing the service. So for example, for example, in a decentralized two-tiered supply chain, there is a coordinator. This coordinator could be a public firm, right? It could be, for example, a tourism corporation. The service provider could be a very local private firm or an entrepreneur who's providing the service, possibly a hotel. So the objective of the service coordinator here is going to be to maximize consumer surplus and also the profits of the service provider, subject to the constraint that its own profit is non-negative. Okay. Now, given this multi-layered service supply chain, we have a simple Stackelberg game, sequential game. We have a deterministic model, so things are going to be very transparent. And we have two different timing structures. So I'm going to present one of the timing structures, but the model is robust enough. All the results go through qualitatively, even if we have a different timing structure. In our timing, the service coordinator is the first mover, and the service provider is the follower. So the service coordinator is the leader, and the service provider is the follower. Some notations: R and K denote the marginal cost of upstream operations. Now, I said the service coordinator is a public firm. It could also be a private firm. If it's a public firm, the marginal cost is R. If it's a private firm, the marginal cost is K. Similarly, in the downstream, the service provider typically is a private firm whose marginal cost is D. So what is the C? Well, if we have a monolithic firm which is providing operations, which is providing both upstream and downstream operations, and this monolithic firm is a public firm, then its marginal cost of downstream operations is C. Right. Now, there are going to be efforts involved by the service provider. That effort is going to have a cost. I'm going to come to that in a moment. So the baseline model one is a monolithic firm. Okay, so think of that as the VI firm. Okay, so there are going to be three models. Model 3 is a specialized case of model 2. Model 4 also will be a specialized case of model 2. What do I mean by that? So the generic model is a decentralized model where the asset ownership and all decisions are going to belong to one single entity, right? So think of all the assets belonging to the service coordinator. The service provider is going to provide the service on site, right, to the consumer. So the service coordinator, the consumer pays the service coordinator the entire amount. So think of this as a tourism package that I've directly paid to the coordinator. The coordinator is going to give a commission fee, or the service provider is going to charge a commission from the service coordinator. That's the W, and the service provider is going to provide the service S. Q denotes the sales of the tourism services. Now, this decentralized model could either be a public-private model. By that, I mean the service coordinator is public and the service provider is private. Or it could also, for example, it could be the Sundarbans World Heritage UNESCO site, which is actually a good example of a public-private chain where the coordinator is a public entity, the government, in fact, a government organization, and the service provider are these small private businesses. Or it could be a private decentralized chain where both the service coordinator and the service provider are both private entities. I'll come to 3 and 4 in just a moment, but let me just illustrate what the model for the public firm and the private firm is. So let's look at the decentralized public-private model. So here, the service coordinator is going to move first. The consumer is going to pay. The consumer is going to pay the service coordinator. So the service coordinator is going to choose the price to charge from the consumer in order to maximize the consumer surplus and also the service provider's profit, right? So this is a different objective for the service coordinator, with the condition that its own profit is non-negative. The follower is the service provider. The service provider is going to choose the level of service that it provides and is going to ask for the commission from the service coordinator. So the service provider is going to choose the commission fee as well as the service effort. This term that you see is the demand. I'll have some results. So I'll in order to save time, I'll get to those results in a moment. But this is the setup of the game. In the private decentralized model, notice private firms are profit maximizing entities. So you don't see the consumer surplus objective. So the service coordinator maximizes its profit. It charges P from the consumer. It pays W as the commission to the service provider, and K is its marginal cost of operations. And the service provider, as before, is going to maximize its profit. Theta I square is the cost of making these service investments. And as I said, that it's a leader-follower game. Service coordinator moves first, then the service provider moves. Okay. Now let's move to the lease model. Okay, so the lease model is sort of a public-private model, which is why I said it's a special case of model 2, where the asset ownership belongs to one entity, which is the service coordinator. The service provider is providing the service, so he's going to lease the asset from the service coordinator. The consumer is actually going to pay the service provider. So contrast this with the previous model, right? So the consumer pays the service provider. The service provider leases the asset from the service coordinator, so has to pay W to the service coordinator. And then, as before, the service provider is going to provide the service S and is going to charge P from the consumer. Okay. So with that in mind, when you look at the lease model, notice what's the objective of the service coordinator? The service coordinator, which is a public entity, is maximizing consumer surplus and the profit of the service provider, but now it's choosing W, as opposed to the previous case where it was choosing the price to charge from the consumer. Okay. As before, the service provider is going to choose the S and the price to charge from the consumer in order to maximize its profit. Okay. It's going to incur a cost of making those investments. The last model is the aggregator model. Think of this as an Airbnb, which is sort of a private interaction, where you're booking something through, you're making a booking through Airbnb. So it's an aggregator, but it's essentially the service provider who's providing the service. And the service provider is paying some commission to the service coordinator. Okay. So the aggregator model here is simply a private chain where the asset ownership, service provision, everything belongs to the service provider, right? In contrast to a lease model where the asset ownership belongs to the service coordinator. Okay. So in the aggregator model, again, we have a two-tier game. In stage 1, the service coordinator is going to choose the commission fee to charge from the service provider, and the service provider is going to choose the price as well as the service effort. Now, so let me get to the results. I have some figures to which will illustrate our findings. The first is, so I presented 3 decentralized models. At the background, which I did not sort of draw here, was the monolithic or the VI, because that was sort of the vertically integrated firm. This is already studied in the literature. The finding is that if I compare a monolithic public firm vis-a-vis a monolithic private firm, as far as service effort, consumer surplus, and social welfare are concerned, the monolithic public firm is always going to perform better than the monolithic private firm. Because the public firm earns 0 profit, the monolithic private firm earns a higher profit and it does better. But on all other parameters, the monolithic public firm is doing better. This is already well studied. What is not studied is the decentralized or the supply chain setting, which is where we are contributing. Now, let's start with a case where all costs, whether it's provided by the public or whether it's provided by the private entity, are equal, right? So let's look at that case. We'll relax that in just a moment. If I compare the decentralized public-private model, which is also the lease model, with a decentralized private-private model, right? So in one case, the service coordinator is a public firm. In the other case, the service coordinator is a private firm. What do we have? Well, as far as service effort, consumer surplus, and social welfare is concerned, the decentralized public-private firm is doing better. Not just that, surprisingly, the private service provider, right? So the service provider, which is a private entity, a local business, an entrepreneur, would rather prefer that the service coordinator is a public firm as opposed to a private firm. The reason being that in a public-private supply chain, the private service provider can extract a higher commission and therefore earn a higher profit. So clearly, when we compare these two models, the public-private outperforms the private-private model. The downstream service provider makes more profit with the public enterprise than with the private, thus helping the government meet its social development goals when the provider is a micro enterprise. A couple of more slides and then I'm done. What if we were to partially privatize, right? So notice that you have a public, either a monolithic public or you have a public-private decentralized chain. Can we privatize the public entity partially? Well, the answer that we get is that irrespective of whether you're partially privatizing the monolithic entity or the decentralized or the public entity in the decentralized model, the public case is always better in the sense that in the monolithic case, the public dominates the partial private, dominates the private firm. In the decentralized setting, the public-private decentralized model dominates the partially public-private, which further dominates the private-private. So this is essentially a new result that we are contributing in the sense that the economics literature talks about the fact that partial privatization might be beneficial for a firm from a firm context. We don't find that here because we impose a restriction that the public entity's profit should be non-negative. Okay. A couple of very quick points. In our previous finding, all costs were equal. What if the costs of the public firm is different from that of the private firm? Our model is robust enough in the sense that there are conditions on upstream costs, downstream costs, and the costs of investments provided by the public entity, such that the same results that we had earlier can be replicated, right? So even with non-equal costs, where there are specifically higher costs for the public entity, we find that the public-private is going to outperform the private-private decentralized model. In closure, what have we found? Well, the common perception is that a private setting or private ownership is going to perform better compared to public ownership as far as service delivery is concerned. But what we find is that takes a very, very myopic view, simply because when you take a supply chain perspective, right, the public-private configuration provides as good or even better social welfare compared to all forms of private configurations. In fact, we argue that in two-tier service coordination supply chains, the government should retain upstream operations. In fact, we just showed that partial privatization is not improving on a fully public-private supply chain setting. Also, through a public-private supply chain setting, the government can achieve its social development goals, one of which is inclusive tourism. Now, how do you achieve this inclusive tourism? This is my last slide, and then I'll stop, because inclusive tourism helps minimize the linkage between policy making and grassroots benefits. Why? Because in a public-private service supply chain, it's important to keep in mind that the private entity is typically someone from the marginalized community, is someone who is actually a small entrepreneur or a small business. And this private firm prefers to be associated in a public-private setting as opposed to a private-private setting. Lastly, Schijvens and Biddulph in 2018 have said that who controls and make decisions about tourism development has a big influence on inclusive development. While tourism players are centrally concerned with profit maximization, it is unlikely that the tourism industry in a private setting will always act responsibly and reflect the interests of the wider society, including private service providers downstream with the public firm coordinating the upstream services delivers higher welfare, better service level, and lower costs to consumers. I'll stop here and I'm open to questions.
Sorry, Vinay. Thank you so much. It was an excellent presentation, especially given the fact that it's, I think, almost 11 p.m. your time. So thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for...
But to be honest, we don't have... I see that Amir mentioned a very good question in the chat box. But our next presenter, Tong, is going to connect from Vietnam, which is already 12:30 a.m. This time. And we even don't have a second for a question. If you don't mind, we move to the next presentation then.
Sure. Thank you, Amir. I'll reply to that question in the chat box.
Thank you so much.